And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to finish up talking about the classical criticisms of the Keynesian model. The first one we said was a very practical criticism. That was the idea of lags. Keynes, good idea, but just can't work in practice would be that argument because of lags. The second argument was that the government, by changing spending, really can't shift the aggregate demand curve because of the idea of crowding out. And we said this is open for debate, but that is the idea that some of the classical economists would argue. You try to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, but it's really just going to shift right back to the left because of crowding out. I talked about that on a previous video. So what do the classical economists really think then? What the classical economists really think is, and this is kind of a third criticism, and maybe better to say it's actually a statement of the some of the belief systems of some of the classical economists, and that is this: the Keynesians tend to look at the spending side. They tend to look at the aggregate demand side. So they would say, like, to solve problems, you want to focus on spending. If there's a problem in the economy, that probably means there's not enough spending, and you solve that through increasing government spending and cutting taxes. That's the main fiscal policy response. But there's also what is called the supply side fiscal policy response, and I would argue that these supply siders are probably in the minority in the macroeconomic profession, but they're kind of a loud minority, and they at least deserve some attention, and maybe they're even right. We get into that debate. Their argument is that really what we should focus on is not the spending. We should really focus on production. That should really be what the focus is when we think about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We should focus on production. And specifically, we should focus on how taxes affect production. So when you're thinking about it from a Keynesian point of view, the idea is spending. So their idea is if you cut taxes, that will increase consumption, and that will mean more spending. The aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. But that's not what the supply siders are thinking. What the supply siders are thinking, so let me just get rid of that. The supply siders are thinking something more like this. The supply siders are thinking that cutting taxes increases the incentive to work. If you cut taxes, I mean, after all, like if taxes were 100% of my income is what I paid in taxes at the extreme, if that were my marginal tax rate, then, obviously I probably wouldn't go to work very often. But if you cut my taxes, well, then I will work more. And again, this is another debatable issue, but I'm just making the argument that some of the classical economists would make, and that is that if you cut taxes, you increase the incentive to work. People will work more. So this is looking at things from the production point of view. If you decrease taxes, that will increase the amount of work that people are willing to engage in, both the entrepreneurs and the workers. And that, if you have people working more, that's going to shift the aggregate supply curves. It's going to shift both of them, that should say to the right. It's going to shift both of them to the right. So now what will happen is if you cut taxes, forget about shifting the aggregate demand curve, the long run aggregate supply curve is going to shift. Say out to long run aggregate supply curve 2. Long run aggregate supply is going to shift. The short run aggregate supply is going to go with it. It's going to go with it. And so now what happens is we end up at this new equilibrium where prices are going to go down. We're going to get a decrease in the price level. GDP is going to go up, and unemployment's going to fall. So the supply siders would say we need to cut taxes, but why are we cutting taxes? Not to shift the aggregate demand curve. We are cutting taxes to encourage work, and that will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve out to the right, and that will mean decrease prices, increase gross domestic product, and decrease in unemployment. Okay? And so that, that would be the best of all worlds. You're getting lower inflation, higher GDP, more people going to work. This would be the supply side position. So the supply siders are typically going to say, they're going to give the same answer all the time, or at least a lot of the time, and that is to say their argument is decrease taxes. And then the other thing that I did not say, decrease taxes and deregulate. Deregulate. So regulations are just rules that businesses have to follow. And those rules, sometimes they're for safety and other kind of good reasons that might say all kind of different things about safety requirements if you're building a restaurant, and various different safety things that have to be placed in the kitchen, or the number of doors or exits in a restaurant or something like this. And it costs money to add those extra doors and things like this. So regulations, we debate whether they're good or bad, but they're costly. Regulations are costly, and so if you deregulate, and specifically these guys would typically say, get rid of the unnecessary regulations, which in and of itself could be a debatable thing, whether or not the regulation is necessary. But if you deregulate, get rid of what they might call these unnecessary rules, deregulate, then more businesses will open, and you'll get more production, and the curve will shift to the right. So cut taxes and deregulate. I think if we think about the 1980s, this is a lot about what the Reagan Revolution was about in the 1980s. He was very much of a supply sider, right? Cut taxes, deregulate, get out of the way, and let that long-run aggregate supply curve shift out to the right. Was he right? Are the Keynesians right? I mean, these are, people would debate these all day. I'm not going to take a stand on it in this video. Just saying that there are some supply-side classical economists who believe that you do not focus on shifting that aggregate demand curve like the Keynesians do. Instead, you focus on shifting that long-run aggregate supply curve. That should be the focus. So when I say fiscal policy, typically what I mean when I say fiscal policy, I mean normal old, when economists use this language, fiscal policy, we mean Keynes' fiscal policy. We mean Keynes' idea of changing government spending and changing taxes. All right? The only time that fiscal policy means something other than that is if we use this language where we say supply side fiscal policy. Supply side fiscal policy. And supply side fiscal policy, that says that you focuses on decreasing taxes and, well, no reason for me to rewrite that again. That focuses on what we just said right here, cutting taxes and deregulating. That's what that focuses on to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve. All right? But most of the time, I just want to make this point very clear, most of the time when we say fiscal policy, we mean the Keynes stuff. We mean changing government spending, changing taxes in order to shift the aggregate demand curve. All right. Thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast, and we'll see you on the next podcast.